Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jordan Ben-Shia. I'm the Executive Director of the VIN Foundation, and we're very excited to be doing this Veterinary Interns and Residents webinar with our student debt education expert, Dr. Tony Bartels. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with Tony and are very grateful, as I am, for his huge expertise in helping us navigate this wild, wild west situation that we are in with student loans. And so a couple housekeeping things. We have the chat, but we like to try and keep that for tech questions or any tech issues. There is a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you could click that button and put any questions in there, we are going to do our best to answer all of our questions. We also have Taylor from our VIN Foundation team here, and her and I are going to be in the background quickly answering as fast as possible your questions, and then Tony will also be answering many of them live. But if you can put all of your questions in there, that will give us the opportunity to ensure that we are covering them. There's also an option within the Q&A box to give a question an upvote. So if you see one that you think, absolutely, I want to make sure that one's answered, go ahead and give that a thumbs up upvote, and that will help bump it to the top. And that way we'll know that that's an important question for more than just one attendee. And other than that, I'm going to hand it over to Tony. One more thing is we will be sending out an email with this recording along with additional helpful information within the next couple days. So keep an eye out for an email from Student Debt at VIN Foundation. And now I will turn it over to you, Tony.
Great. Thank you, Jordan, and welcome everyone. Thank you, Taylor, in advance for helping in the background. If you've attended any of these sessions before, we tend to get a lot of questions, and I expect nothing different in this one just because of all of the uncertainty. I could see that in a lot of the questions you submitted as part of your registration. And for those of you that submitted the student debt and income signalment form, thank you as always. Some of you I've already posted replies to on the message boards, and then some of you I'll use as examples tonight anonymously so we can illustrate some of these concepts. But ideally, it works best if you've looked at your student loans and used some of the VIN Foundation resources and you can ask those sorts of questions. And if not, we're going to walk through some of that so you can upload your student data into those tools and know exactly what you're looking at and have an opportunity to ask questions as well. The intern resident one we're focusing on specifically because there's some unique challenges associated with that career pathway, depending on where you are in that process and how long you think you're going to be in that process, and also some of the details around that. This one is particularly personal to me because my wife is a specialist. She's a small animal internist here in Denver where we live. And, we kind of struggled through this together as she was trying to figure out her student loans through that advanced training pathway. And unfortunately, you all just don't get enough education on your student loans from either the respective institutions that you're working for that training through or outside of that, and nor do you really have the time to to work that into your schedule. So thank you for taking the time tonight to join that. Which brings me to one of the other themes that I've been noticing lately is people that are kind of in a frantic bit of a panic around their student loans and keep saying they don't have time to deal with them. And I totally get that, but you're going to have to make time, right? And those of you that are here tonight obviously are making time, and those that are going to watch this recording later are making time. So that's not necessarily you all, but if you ignore them, it's going to be worse, right? And unfortunately, you just have to babysit your loans way more than you otherwise would have to during these weird transition period, this kind of unprecedented period of uncertainty we have with the student loan repayment system. And we're going to talk about that a lot tonight as well. So a lot of you have questions about SAVE, the status of SAVE. Some of you may even be in the SAVE forbearance. We're going to talk about that. A lot of you are worried about public service loan forgiveness, and I keep hearing from some people and some schools and some students that are saying that their school is telling them that public service loan forgiveness is gone. Public service loan forgiveness is not gone. Nobody's trying to get rid of it. It's even in the updated legislation that's working its way through Congress. So while SAVE is a completely different beast and is probably going away, public service loan forgiveness isn't going anywhere, right? So hopefully before we get too far down the road here, I want to at least try to quell that rumor that public service loan forgiveness is somehow going to be eliminated or already has, and that's just not true. So, but I do think that part of this uncertainty, confusion, throwing everything at the fan at once is part of the goal, right? The more confusion, the more this particular administration will get you to pay more towards your student loans, and the less will be forgiven, right? So and that's really not the goal of public service loan forgiveness. And many of you are going to be on a public service loan forgiveness pathway just by virtue of your advanced training. And some of you may continue on working in academia or otherwise in a nonprofit organization that would be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So don't throw that out just yet, right? That is definitely still a viable pathway for your student loans and is probably the quickest and cheapest way of eliminating your student loans. That's another common question we get is what's the quickest and cheapest way for me to pay back my student loans? Public service loan forgiveness is usually always the answer, right? So it's just a matter of whether or not your career path will align with public service loan forgiveness and you do all of the right things to make sure that you are checking the boxes to earn public service loan forgiveness. All right, so feel free to ask any questions along the way. I see, Roman, you've already jumped in. About to finish your residency, we're definitely going to cover that possibility and how you can transition from a relatively low income to something that's much higher than you've been earning. But before we get to that, I want to just kind of set the stage a little bit on how we're going to deal with this. So I started putting together some notes on how I wanted to present this and realized that I don't really lay it out specifically to cover the timeline, if you will, of where you are in this advanced training process, right? So a lot of you are just graduating and just getting started, whether you're going right into an internship or directly into a residency or some other kind of grad school experience. That's going to behave a little bit differently than those of you like Roman who are finishing their residency and is transitioning from a residency salary into a specialty salary, right? So there's everywhere from getting started to finishing and in between, right? And depending on where you fall along that timeline is where we want to focus. All of those are going to then correspond to, well, what's your student debt to income ratio, right? So if you're just graduating and getting started, what's your current student debt to income ratio? So I take my student debt balance, I divide it by my income, I get a number, my student debt to income ratio. As I'm finishing my residency training and I'm thinking about my post-training income, what's my post-training debt to income ratio? What's my student debt at that time? What's my income going to be after that training? That's my new debt to income ratio, right? That debt to income ratio we can use as a guideline for how best to think about repaying your student loans, right? And for those of you just getting started, obviously you're going to want the lowest monthly payment possible. But even for some of you who are finishing, depending on what your debt to income ratio is, you may want to continue using an income-driven repayment strategy until you see your income consistently higher and you're required to pay more, right? The way the income-driven plans work is you're not necessarily required to pay more just because your income increased in the middle of the year, right? They use a older income documentation or your previous tax return that may still show a lower income, and you can still have a lower payment for at least a little while. And that can really help in that transition phase as you move from a resident to a specialist and start to jumpstart your overall financial wellness strategy, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can use these plans to our benefit, no matter where we are in this particular journey through the advanced training. So here are some of the things that I'm looking for. If I'm just getting started, we did about a month ago, we did a 2025 new grad playbook, and there's a link to it here. We talked a lot about consolidation. We've since released a lot of support materials and additional blog posts called the Consolidation Conundrum, where there's a link here to that. I'm going to try not to talk a lot about consolidation tonight because, again, we talked for almost 2 hours about consolidation in the new grad playbook. To the extent that it comes up with questions, I'm happy to answer those. But I'm going to try not to focus so much on consolidation because that's something unique to the just getting started, the 2025 grad. And for the most part, you're probably not going to want to consolidate unless you have some of these health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students. You may want to consolidate those, but chances are you're going to want to let those grace periods run for as long as they can. Set some reminders so you can consolidate these health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students later, so you can make them eligible for something like an income-driven repayment plan or public service loan forgiveness. Some of that's going to depend upon when you start and what type of training you're doing. Those of you that are going into grad school or PhD program, kind of few and far between, but that's another one of those areas where you really want to lean on that consolidation, right? So there's some specific circumstances where consolidation can be really helpful as you're getting started. But for the most part, if it's just, you've got all direct loans, you're not working towards public service loan forgiveness, you just want to let that grace period run its course and then apply for an income-driven plan as that grace period's expiring. But, that presents some challenges too, because you're going to be kind of in the midst of your internship residency experience when you're then going to have to pop your head back up when that grace period is expiring and planning to apply for that income-driven plan so you keep your payment low, right? So those are challenges that you're going to have to work through. And, we talked a lot about those during the new grad playbook and in the support materials there. Some of that's going to depend on, whether or not you had filed a tax return before you graduated. So a 2024 tax return, adjusted gross income, that's what AGI stands for. If you have that recently filed tax return, that is income documentation you can use no matter what your current income information is, right? So they'll always take that recently filed tax return as valid income documentation when you apply for an income-driven plan. We're going to talk a lot tonight about IDR profiles, right? So these are classifications based on your borrowing history that you can use to put yourself into. There's technically 5 IDR profiles, but there's probably only 3 that anyone here tonight is going to be concerned with. And most of you are probably in this first one, which is the most flexible, but we want to make sure we know that for sure. So we'll check our student loans. I'll show you how you can do a good physical exam of your student loans and know what IDR profile you're in. And that'll tell you which income-driven repayment options you're eligible to use, even during this transition period and period of uncertainty around the student loan repayment programs. We also want to think about our estimated time to completion for this training. Some of you might be just doing an internship only, right? And so you're just going to be temporarily trying to get some student loan repayment relief. And then depending on what you're doing after that, you'll either continue using those plans or you will shift gears. Some of you, that internship is a stepping stone to a residency, right? So you may have a prolonged period of advanced training, and then PhD programs are even longer, right? So it really depends on, how long do I see myself in this advanced training journey. If you're in that in between, a couple of different things we're looking at, how much time do I have left? Am I in a program that could be public service loan forgiveness eligible? Right. So if you're doing an academic internship, if you're doing an academic residency, those are opportunities to earn public service loan forgiveness while you're doing that training. Right. Now, there's some if statements around that we have to contend with, right? So it depends on what plan you're using. Are you in the SAVE forbearance, right? Because if you're in the SAVE plan, the courts block that plan. They put everybody in a forbearance. And unfortunately, you're not earning any forgiveness credit, but you're also not being charged any interest. So a little bit of a double-edged sword there. Do I want to leave my loans not costing me anything, but not earning forgiveness credit? Or do I want to potentially move them out of that SAVE forbearance into a plan that would allow me to earn credit, maybe public service loan forgiveness credit? Right. So some other things that we need to be thinking about there if you're in the middle of your training experience. Same things, we want to know what our minimum monthly payment is now. What is my current income versus my most recently filed tax return? This is really relevant for those of you that might be transitioning from an internship into a residency, particularly if you did a private practice internship or maybe a second internship, and now you're in an academic residency that could be paying you less, right? So your current income could theoretically be less than your most recently filed tax return. And in that case, we want to use the lower of the two numbers, right? So you can either use that tax return, they'll always take that. But if that tax return represents a higher number than you're currently earning, then you can use your recent income documentation instead to get an even lower monthly payment using an income-driven plan. We want to start thinking about our post-training income again. Is my debt to income ratio going to be greater than 1 still, or will it be less than 1 as I finish up my training? Those types of things should start to become more in focus, particularly as you're working your way through that residency training. And then for some of you, if this is old hat, right? If you're a second year resident or maybe a third year resident or even finishing up, you want to know how much forgiveness qualifying time you have, right? Depending on the plan that you're using and the plans that survive these updates that Congress are currently looking at, you may have a relatively short period of time remaining until you reach forgiveness, right? So we want to make sure we understand where we are in that forgiveness timeline before we go and switch gears and maybe start paying aggressively towards our student loans, right? Because you could very easily, just because you're earning more money doesn't mean it's an automatic, I need to pay the loans off as fast as possible. You could still end up paying more than you have to, right? So we want to make sure that everybody understands their options and how to check where they are in that process so you don't leave any money on the table. And the numbers can be pretty significant. The IDR profiles will still play a huge role there, right? So IDR profile 1, those are the folks that are most likely going to have the shortest remaining time to forgiveness of all of the IDR profiles. So if you're in IDR profile 1, that forgiveness path becomes more relevant no matter how much money you're earning after your residency training, right? So we'll talk about that more too. And as you're finishing up, we've already alluded to this a little bit, so there's some overlap here. I want to know what my repayment plan is. Am I in the save forbearance? Am I in something else? What's my current income? What's my last year's income? What's my post-training income going to be? Again, I want to know what that forgiveness count is, whether I've got public service loan forgiveness credit or my income-driven repayment plan forgiveness credit, right? Particularly if I'm in this IDR profile 1, because I either have 20 years to hit forgiveness under a plan like IVR, or if I'm still working towards public service loan forgiveness, I may only have a few years to reach the 10 years required to hit public service loan forgiveness. Right. So these are all questions I want to answer before I embark on a, aggressive repayment strategy. Right. Everybody wants to see their loans disappear sooner rather than later. But how much is that going to cost me? And is there an alternative pathway that could save me more money? And in many cases, the answer is yes. So this is how I'm kind of, grouping these things together tonight. There is a lot of overlap amongst the groups, right? So that recent adjusted gross income, right? If you're not sure what an AGI is, tonight's a great time to ask some questions about it. If you file the tax return, you could pull up that tax return and just look for the AGI item, right? Adjusted gross income is a line item right off of that tax return. That's the number that they will plug in to the equation that calculates your payment using an income-driven repayment plan. The IDR profiles are going to be based on your borrowing history and the types of loans that you have. I'll show you how you can check that relatively easily using the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. And then we've got some that overlap, but not across all of the groups, right? So one of the really important areas that I didn't want to forget to mention is during your advanced training pathway, if you're enrolled in school at least half time, then you could see your loans put back into an in-school deferment automatically, and you don't want that, right? And this applies more so to folks that are doing academic residencies. Many times you're doing a master's of clinical science or some other type of master's, or PhD programs also will often have you enrolled at least half time in school, and that's a trigger in the system, in the Department of Education system, to automatically defer your loans. So just like when you were in veterinary school and you received student loans, the system knew to automatically defer them and not require you to make payments. When you are in one of these other programs, like an academic residency with a master's or a PhD program, or some other kind of grad school program that has you taking courses, and if you meet the quote half-time, at least half-time criteria, then your loans will automatically be put into deferment, even if they've been in repayment, right? And deferment, in-school deferment time does not count towards any kind of forgiveness credit, right? So we want to make sure that we're not in one of those deferment statuses, particularly in one of those grad school or academic residency programs, so we can continue earning our forgiveness credit. In most cases, our payments are going to be very low, if not zero, which is great, but also is hard to differentiate between an in-school deferment and something that actually provides you forgiveness credit. In many of these cases, we want to know periodically, we need to check in, what's my current minimum monthly payment? What repayment plan am I actually using? If I'm using an income-driven plan, what's my anniversary date, right? Many of you, especially if you're towards the tail end of your training, you haven't had to provide any income documentation for a long time, right? So we're starting to get back into that. It's been really, really messy as we've come out of that pandemic forbearance period and tried to turn the system back on. It's been a mess. And then we switched administrations and it's become even more of a mess. So knowing when you're supposed to provide your income documentation is not only challenging, but something that you have to stay on top of. All right, those forgiveness counts, I'll show you how you can check those forgiveness counts as well. The student loan physical exam, this is what I'm looking for, right? We want to make sure we know what loan types we have. Of course, the amounts we need to be aware of, the various interest rates for the different loans. And this is also where we're going to find some of our repayment plan information, right? So we'll see any repayment plans that are listed there if I'm already in repayment. If I'm a new graduate, I want to see that my loans are in a grace period. So if I do consolidate them, I know that they're ready, right? So these are the repayment plan status, and the current repayment plan that you're in are pieces of information I'll show you how to find. And then also that IDR profile will be based on that borrowing history that you have. The data will also show you what your minimum monthly payments are. It may not be entirely accurate, particularly if you're in some kind of forbearance status. The anniversary dates will be listed there. That's something that we can use to double check our loan servicers. And the forgiveness counts, the public service loan forgiveness counts will live in your data file, but the IDR forgiveness counts will live outside of that. So we'll show you how to get to those as well. All right, so before I get into too much of that, the secret to federal student loan repayment, all right, you're going to pay your balance to zero one way or another. All right, I know there's a lot of uncertainty, to put it lightly, right? But you have the options with your federal student loans to make payments based on your income, and forgiveness is still there. You'll either pay the balance to zero before you hit forgiveness, or you won't, right? And you'll hit forgiveness, right? So either is fine, right? But the key is to not pay more than you're required to pay, or sacrifice other more critical areas of your overall financial wellness to accelerate your federal student loan payoff. Your student loans are not going to prevent you from doing anything. I see a lot of concern, a lot of questions about how am I going to navigate and pay back my student loans, or how am I going to even pursue a residency with my student loan balance? And you can, right? There are always ways to keep your payments a manageable percentage of your income, right? Now, how that turns out is going to ultimately depend on how much income you earn, right? And how long you're in repayment, right? So you'll either hit forgiveness or you'll hit zero, right? Because your income is high enough to generate a high enough payment to pay the balance down, or it's not, and you hit the end point, which is forgiveness, and that balance is forgiven, and you may have to pay tax on that when the balance is forgiven down the road. Right? But as long as you're prepared for that, that should also be something that you can overcome. right? So their student loans will be extinguished one way or another, right? It's just a matter of how that actually happens. And I know it doesn't feel like it, and sometimes it certainly doesn't seem like that when you have to call your loan servicer, but your federal student loans are the most flexible debt that you're ever going to have, right? They're the most annoying debt you're going to have too, because it's nearly impossible to know exactly what the options are at any given moment, since we've decided to swing back and forth wildly here the last several years, right? But those options are there, right? So you have to unfortunately know more about them than you've ever had because of all the uncertainty, but they are still available to you. So see, these were some of the concerns that came in, right? So paying it back while working for a nonprofit, right? That screams public service loan forgiveness to me, right? And all of the academic veterinary institutions are nonprofits or 501c3 nonprofits. So that time can be eligible for public service loan forgiveness as long as you're doing all of the right things. Paying off such a high debt load as fast as possible, well, during an internship and residency pathway, that's probably not going to happen, right? I mean, if you think about it, you need resources to pay down student debt, and internship residency pathways are typically not high paying, right? And if you've got six-figure student loan debt, then paying loans back as fast as possible is just not something that's attainable, right? So not until you actually have an income that will allow you to do that, can you even consider that, right? And even when you're able to do so, you want to still make sure that you're not going to pay more than you have to because of all the other factors that we've just laid out, right? So I'm not a huge fan of the as fast as possible, and they certainly can work, right? But as long as you're not putting yourself at huge financial risk just to pay back your student loans, I don't think they make a lot of sense, right? And particularly if you're going to, forego other more critical areas of your financial wellness, it certainly doesn't pay to do that. Right? Your federal student loans will not prevent you from doing anything that you want to do personally or professionally, as long as you know how to manage them. And then, the big elephant in the room here, what's happening with the income-based repayment, and will that continue to be a future option post-advanced training? And the answer is yes. Right now, what exactly they look like is still kind of up in the air, but there are any of the proposals that are on the table now and the ones that are nearly across this legislative finish line are not eliminating all of income-driven repayment options, right? They're changing them, right? But they're not eliminating all of them, right? So those will still be in the arsenal of options that are there to help you pay back your student loans. So this IDR plan profile, what does that look like? I'm going to show you what that is. And here I'm going to take you to the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. All right, so this is a publicly available resource. Anybody can use it and everybody does use it, but it's specifically designed for veterinarians and veterinary students. And you all are on this, I graduated from veterinary school side of things. It does require your student aid data file, right? So many of you have already figured out how to get that. There is a tutorial here on this page, if you scroll down a little bit farther, on how you can find your student aid data file on studentaid.gov, right? So I'm going to bypass that tonight. I'm just assuming that you guys all know how to get to that. If somebody is not finding it or needs help finding it, just let me know and I'll go through that with my student loans as well. But I'm going to presume that you've already been able to find that My Student Aid data file, right? It's an ugly looking TXT file that's available through that studentaid.gov portal. And then once you have that, you upload it into here. I would recommend that you log in to the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center while you're doing that. You can see here, it knows who I am, right? And everybody here anyone, as long as you have a VIN username and password, even if you're not currently a VIN member, it will work. So it will allow you to log into here so you can upload that student aid data file. So I'm going to upload one here. I've got several to use to demonstrate, right? So this is, let's see, let me find the one here. This one is somebody who's just finishing up their residency training. and they're going to be moving from a $50,000 resident income to an anticipated $300,000 specialty income, right? Which puts them at a debt to income ratio that's right around 1, right? So student debt here total is about 300,000. If I divide it by my post training income in this case, that's 300,000. 300 divided by 300 is 1. Right? So my post training debt to income ratio is 1. That suggests that you will pay the balance to 0 before you hit forgiveness. However, this person's also probably going to have some forgiveness credit logged since they graduated in 2016, right? So depending on how far down the forgiveness path they are, they may still have a pathway to hit forgiveness before they pay the balance to 0. All right, so those are things that we want to explore. All right, so I could see that I've got $260,000 of principal. I've got about $35,000 of unpaid interest. Right, so this is the interest that accrued while I was doing this advanced training because my minimum monthly payments were not enough to cover the monthly interest. Right, so this interest accrues, right, but I don't get charged any additional interest on this particular interest. I get charged interest on the principal only. This is one of those benefits that come with your federal student loans, that you're not charged interest on this interest. Right, another common misconception with your federal student loans is that they compound. Right, they don't compound. Right, this is why I see people generally throwing money at their student loans, trying to avoid what they think is a compounding interest effect on their student loans. And your student loans just don't behave that way. Right? If your income doesn't generate a payment that covers all of the monthly interest, then don't try. Right? Not particularly while you're doing your training. Right? It's okay to have an unpaid interest balance. Right? You're not getting charged any additional interest on this interest. Right? You'll still pay it back, right? But it's not charging you anything additional. The interest is being generated from the principal alone. There are certain things that can take this interest and add it to your principal called capitalization, right? And we want to be aware of those, and we want to try to avoid those particular capitalization triggers. I see my weighted average interest rate here. It looks like, and we've got some new features in here, if you haven't been in here in a while, that indicate whether or not you're using the auto pay, right? So auto pay is you have a bank account tied to your student loan account with your loan servicer, and if they are able to deduct the minimum payment due each month, they'll give you a 0.25% interest rate reduction for setting up that quote auto pay feature. Right. So for many of you, particularly those of you that are in the SAVE program, which otherwise is the SAVE forbearance right now because the court has blocked this plan and they automatically moved everybody that was in the SAVE plan into a forbearance with no interest accruing. There's no way to get the auto pay discount because you don't have to make any payments. Right. But you don't have to worry about it anyway because you're not getting charged interest either. Right. So the SAVE forbearance is a great place for your loans to be right now. Right. So I know it may not feel that way, and it feels uncertain, and you want to do something to change that to maybe make some progress. However, when your loans are in that SAVE forbearance, they're also not costing you anything either. Right? You're not earning any forgiveness credit since last July, right? But you're also not getting charged any interest. Right, so that's a pretty fair trade-off for the time being, and particularly for this person who's transitioning from a residency income into a specialty income. Right, these loans are not costing this person anything. Right, leave them alone. Leave them alone until we hear more about what's going to be required of those folks that are in the SAVE forbearance. Right, we don't exactly know what that transition from SAVE is going to look like just yet, right? But I don't have to worry about it too much other than keeping tabs of the information and the timeline of when I might have to act, of which there is none right now. right? But until then, I'm not being charged anything for my loans either, right? So that's a pretty good place to be. And if I'm transitioning from a residency to a specialty income, it probably involves a location change, maybe not, but probably does, right? I want to update my budget to reflect my new expenses in that new location, right? I want to make sure that I'm jumpstarting the rest of my financial wellness, addressing any other less flexible debt I might have, like credit card debt I might have accrued during my advanced training, uh, any other less flexible loans that I could attack while my income is high and I don't have to make a payment on my federal student loans. I want to make sure that I'm starting, boosting, building, playing catch up with my tax advantage retirement savings, things like 401ks, right? So getting all of those things in motion before I'm required to make any payments on my federal student loans, all the while, if I'm in the save forbearance, it's not costing me anything. That's a great opportunity to really jumpstart those other areas of your overall financial wellness. Right. So for those of you that are finishing that training, if your loans are in that save plan, that's a great place to be. One of the other things I want to look at, though, and this is going to lead me to the IDR eligibility, there's an IDR eligibility tab here in the My Student Loans tool. And I want to see which income-driven repayment options I have available to me, recognizing that save is not long for this world, right? At some point, I'm in the save forbearance. This person's in the save forbearance. We're going to be either forced to move or we're forced to choose another repayment option. Which option is that going to be? That's where the IDR profile comes into play. Right now, this person is an IDR profile 2, which means they're not eligible for the new version of IBR. Right, so there's 2 versions of IBR. There's an old version, right, IBR 2009, and there's a new version. IBR 2014 designates that if your first loan that you received from the Department of Education was after July 1st of 2014, then you would be eligible for the new version of IBR instead of the old version of IBR. If you don't meet that requirement, then you're only eligible for the old version of IBR. Why is that important? The new version of IBR is better than the old version, right? The new version of IBR and Pay As You Earn are very similar, right? They both have 20-year maximum time frames, which means you hit forgiveness at the 20-year point in repayment versus the old version is 25 years. The payments are generally lower under the new version of IBR and Pay As You Earn than they are under the old version. Right. So if you're eligible for the new version of IBR, you're more likely to reach forgiveness, even with a debt to income ratio of 1, than somebody who's not eligible for the new version of IBR. Right. And while they still can use Pay As You Earn, right, Pay As You Earn is probably going away as well. Right. Not as certain as the save plan, but the new legislation pretty much kills Pay As You Earn as well. Right. Which means that you're not going to have, if you're in IDR profile 2, you're not going to have any 20-year pathway to forgiveness. Right. It's either going to be the 25-year version, or if they're successful in getting this new version they're talking about past the Repayment Assistance Program, or RAP, that has a 30-year time frame towards forgiveness. Right. So the IDR profile kind of sets the stage for where do I go next, or at least where can I consider going next. Right. You don't have to make any choices right now because this person's in save. Loans aren't costing you anything. You're not required to move just yet. Right. But if and when you're required to move and Pay As You Earn isn't an option for you, then this person is going to be looking at the old version of IBR, maybe that new repayment plan if they are able to pass that one through, or some non-income driven repayment option. Right. So that's what I'm looking at in this particular student loan physical exam. Right. So I know my income driven repayment eligibility. I know which repayment option I'm currently in. My monthly payment here, doesn't make a lot of sense. This actually, what this refers to is what the standard 10-year plan amount is going to be. Right. So let's say they moved you out of save and you didn't choose another option, right? they'll put you in the standard 10-year plan by default, right? And that payment to extinguish this remaining balance in 10 years is $3,500 a month. And that might be fine, right? When you're earning 300 grand a year, that could be a fine monthly payment for your budget, right? But chances are you can get something a little bit lower, right? So after you refine your budget, you have a more consistent idea of what your income is. You can choose, I'm either going to pay that, or maybe I'm going to pursue something that has a lower payment that potentially will lead me to forgiveness down the road, right? And when we talk about, particularly those of you that have been in repayment for a while, we want to know what our IDR progress is, right? And that is a different, so income-driven repayment options have time associated with them, just like public service loan forgiveness, right? It's not as easy to check, but the IDR progress is an important element of your analysis between considering an income-driven repayment strategy versus paying the remaining balance to zero before hitting forgiveness, right? And for a while, the studentaid.gov portal would show you your IDR progress, right? And since the administrations have switched, they pulled that down. And while that was available, we had built a extension, a browser extension that you could install into either Chrome or even Microsoft Edge and download that progress. Now, rumor has it they're going to be putting that IDR counter, that progress tracker, back up on studentaid.gov soon. Right? For those of you that might be using IBR, you probably still see it, but not many people are using IBR right now. Most people are either in Save or Pay or some other version of income-driven repayment. But if you're in IBR, you may even still see your IDR progress. In the meantime, there is another way that you can check your IDR progress. And it's this API that I think was the version 1 that the Department of Education built for the loan servicers to be able to extract that payment, that IDR payment history as well. And this is still available. Right, so if you log into studentaid.gov, you'll be able to, and I'll post this in the chat here, you'll be able to see your IDR progress. So this, again, is more relevant to those of you that have been in repayment for a number of years, right? But you want to check and see, particularly given all of the forgiveness count adjustments and things that have been done over the last several years, where you are in the income-driven repayment timeframe. So I'll show you how this works. So you have to log in first to studentaid.gov. I've got phone here, so studentaid.gov. You log in. Going to do our super secret verification here. And there's some people that always get freaked out that I'm posting my password here. This is a one-time code that every time I log in, it gives me a new one. So, oh, now I'm screwed up. 6. Oop, it's supposed to be a 6. So scary language. So once I'm logged in, right? So here's my account. And here's my student loan balance. There's my principal. There's my unpaid interest. While I'm in here really quickly, if I hit this view details button, right, this is where I can find my download my aid data. So if you didn't know where to find your student aid data file, this is exactly where it lives. This download my aid data file. If I go back to here on this initial dashboard page, this is where the IDR progress used to live, was right here along the right-hand side. Right, so some of you may still see it. If you've got public service loan forgiveness credit, you may still see a public service loan forgiveness counter, but it will also live along this side. If you're in IBR, you may see your IDR forgiveness progress tracker, in which case you don't have to use this ugly looking other link. So here's this other link that I posted in the chat. And if I copy and paste that into another window while I'm logged in to studentaid.gov, this is what your forgiveness progress count looks like. My apologies, I didn't create this API. The data is quite ugly, but buried in here is how much qualifying time I have for my student loans. My loans are consolidated, so I only have 2 remaining loans in my portfolio. I have 157 payments remaining, which is roughly 13 years. All right, so this is how you can check how much forgiveness time you have available before you decide on which repayment strategy you want to use going forward, particularly if you're finishing your training. Right, so if we kind of run this to fruition, let's send this over to the repayment simulator. This person graduated in 2016. Let's assume they have something close to 8 or 9 years in repayment, right? You can confirm that using that IDR progress, that API that I just demonstrated, right? You can plug that in, right? We're going to put our income information in here, right? 300,000, right? But they're coming from an income that was 45,000 before, right? When if you're transitioning, and this is what I call the post-training on-ramp, right? Using income-driven repayment to kind of on-ramp your student loan repayment strategy, right? Last year's AGI based on my residency income is probably 45,000, right? When I file my tax return in early 2026 for the 2025 year, it's probably going to be some blend between my residency income and my my specialty income, right? So maybe it's, let's say it's 195, right? It's not quite the 300 yet, right? So I'll have a payment that's a little bit higher when I use that income, right? But not quite based on the higher income, right? So I'm going to leave the family information out of here for now. I'm not going to fill out anything in here just yet, but I'm going to run that simulation. And if I'm stuck with IBR 2009, right, I can see I pay the balance to 0 before I hit forgiveness, but it's really, really close, right? So I would have about 10 years left until I hit forgiveness. Sorry, I would have, if I had 9 years of repayment time, I would have 16 years until I hit forgiveness. I pay the balance to 0 in a little more than 14 years, right? So when I'm looking at this, I'm probably not going to embark on an aggressive repayment strategy just yet. I'm going to use the fact that my payment is going to be lower for the next 24 months, right? And then probably ramp up my payment to accelerate that payoff sooner, as long as my income stays at that higher level for the remainder of repayment. Right, but I'm going to use that 24 months to build that on-ramp so I have maximum cash flow to jumpstart all of those other areas of my financial wellness that I haven't really been able to participate in since I've been doing that advanced training. And then I'll pick up on a more aggressive time frame on my student loans a couple years down the road, right? And maybe take a peek at that new repayment option to see if there's any benefit for me using that versus the older version of IBR for the long-term repayment strategy. Right, so that's how I would be thinking about that particular finishing my residency scenario. Right, so same, and I'm kind of looking at Roman's question earlier. I'm about to finish with my residency. My salary as a neurologist will be $225,000 with 26% production. I want to pay my loans off fast within 5 years. Current loan balance is $230,000. Is this doable? Yeah, I mean that's very similar to this case that I just ran. I mean, the 5-year thing, maybe. Right. I don't see any reason why you need to run to that 0 balance in 5 years. I would focus first, again, on kind of playing catch up with those other areas of your overall financial wellness, at least the next couple of years. right? And if you do that and you still have way more money left over in your budget than you know what to do with, and you can eliminate your balance in 5 years, then great, right? But I wouldn't, force yourself into having to pay the balance off in 5 years, right? Here, for a $295,000 balance, to pay it off in 10 years is $3,300. Roughly, if I want to have that, then I'm going to double the payment, right? If I want to pay this back in 5 years, then that's, $6,600 a month, right? At some point, you're going to run into a number that is, kind of punitive, right? It's going to require you to sacrifice some things in your financial wellness, and that's just not necessary, right? Your federal student loans, again, you're going to hit zero, right? You've got a robust income, right? And you'll be able to hit zero, whether it's 5 years, 7 years, 9 years, 10 years. It's really not going to save you all of that money. And if you're smart with what you're doing with the additional cash flow you have access to, you'll well outgrow the savings that you'll have from accelerating that student loan payoff, right? So focus first on those other areas before you really jump in to aggressively paying those student loans off if you're at the end of your residency training. All right, so some of the non-student loan factors that we also want to consider: are we married, right? What's my recent tax filing status? Did I file separately if I'm married? What's my spouse's income? Where do I live? Do I live in a community property state like California or Texas? Does my spouse also have student loans? Those are things that'll play into that analysis as well. Those are things that you can put in to the loan repayment simulator so we can see that impact on our student loan repayment strategy. Do I have any private student loans, right? What do they require me to pay? Private student loans are always less flexible than your federal student loans. Even if the interest rate on your federal student loans is higher, pay off the private student loans faster. Right? If you want to pay something off faster, pay off the private student loans, the credit card debt, the auto loans, any medical debt that you might have, right? All of that is much less flexible than your federal student loans, and it's much more dangerous to your overall financial wellness than your federal student loans. We talked about updating your budget, right? What's your monthly financial ins and outs, right? Hopefully your ins are greater than your outs, right? But when you're doing your training, they may not be, right? And you may need to use a credit card to kind of make ends meet from month to month, right? That's fine, right? But eliminate that first before you worry about aggressively paying back your student loans. And you can use that on-ramp, that income-driven repayment on-ramp, to keep your payments low, to get this sort of thing straightened out first before you aggressively pay back those student loans. Ideally, if you're going to aggressively pay back your student loans, you're going to want to have a robust emergency fund just in case. Right, so first thing you want to do is make sure you have at least an emergency fund equal to 6 months of your expenses. Right, so before, that to me is kind of one of those, red lines, right? Do not aggressively pay off your student loans until after you have a robust emergency fund in place, right? Because something's going to happen, right? And you want to make sure that you're not locked into a significant monthly student loan payment, and then you have to take on credit card debt just to keep maintaining that monthly student loan payment. There's nothing wrong with keeping your monthly student loan payment as low as you possibly can using an income-driven plan, and then voluntarily paying when your budget allows, right? But if you lock yourself into a standard 10-year plan and a high monthly payment, then they're going to expect that as your minimum monthly payment, right? So again, don't put yourself in that position until, again, your budget is figured out, you've got a robust emergency fund, and you generally have more in than out, and you don't even know what to do with it, right? So for many of you, you're a little ways away from that yet, right? So get yourself into that secure financial position before you aggressively start taking on those student loans. And then the longer you spend in training, the further behind you are on the retirement saving aspect of it, right? And there's a lot of opportunity to reduce how much you pay in taxes and boost your long-term savings with things like 401k contributions, right? So make sure that you're at least maximizing those areas of your financial wellness before you pay more than you have to toward your student loans. All right. Okay, I see a couple of other questions there, but I'm going to dive into some of the meat of the repayment options and how they work. Right, so there's two primary ways to pay back your student loans. Right, you have a time-driven option, and for your federal student loans, you have an income-driven option. Right, so your time-driven is kind of traditional repayment. Right, so private loans all operate on some kind of a time-driven scale. Right, so you have a loan, you have interest rates. There's generally a payback time frame defined in that contract that says you will pay this amount back in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And that's what determines that monthly payment. Right? You could do that with your federal student loans, right? If you choose to. That's how a standard 10-year plan works. But your federal student loans are the only loans that you have that you can choose to make payments based on your income. Right? So they take a measure of your income, usually your adjusted gross income from a tax return, and they take a percentage of that to calculate the minimum monthly payment. Right? So those time-driven plan payments, 10-year plan, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, as fast as possible, I guess it's kind of a time-driven plan, right? But you still need to define the time frame. So kind of like Roman did in his question, I want to pay it back in 5 years. Okay, cool. We'll calculate what that payment needs to be to pay that $250,000 balance back in 5 years and see if it fits in your budget, right? But the faster you pay the loans back, right, the shorter the time frame, the higher the monthly payment, right? So again, at some point you're going to run up against resource limitations. Your federal student loans are not that dangerous when it comes to affecting you, that it really warrants that kind of attention. So for example, depending on how much balance you have, so here again, I'll kind of come back and we'll pick on Roman since he was the first person to contribute a question in there. If I've got a $250,000 balance at 7%, and I want to pay it back in 10 years, that's $2,900 a month. Right? If I want to pay it back in 5 years, again, rule of thumb, roughly double. Right? So we're looking at maybe $5,800 a month as a minimum monthly payment if you want to pay that balance back in 5 years. Right? But even with an income of, $220,000 plus, right, your income-driven plan payment is not going to be that high, not anywhere near there. Again, you could choose to pay that if you want to, but I would encourage you to at least have the minimum lower than, the lowest you can get it, and then choose to pay more if your budget allows, rather than forcing yourself into something that may, stretch your budget a little thin. When it comes to the income-driven plans, this is what they kind of look like, right? So this is the part that's kind of in flux, right? So all of these things are still technically available other than SAVE, right? SAVE, you can't apply for it, but those of you that were in it before the court blocked it, it still exists, and your loans will still show SAVE as the repayment plan, right? But no new borrowers can choose it. Right. So those of you that are graduating and trying to get your loans into a repayment plan, unfortunately, SAVE is not going to be an option that you can even select. Right. But you can select these other repayment options. Right. So generally, I prefer people choose a strategy that provides them forgiveness credit. Right. Whether you think you're going to hit forgiveness or not, log the forgiveness credit, just in case you need it, right? You never know what might happen, right? Whether that's something happens to you, something happens to the student loan repayment system, something that makes forgiveness more of a likelihood than less of a likelihood. You want to make sure that you have that forgiveness credit and can use it, rather than finding out that, wow, I could have used the forgiveness credit and I don't have any. Right. And that comes down to which plan you choose. Right. The time-driven plans are fine, except that they don't provide forgiveness credit, except the 10-year plan. Right. The most aggressive of the options that are available in the federal system. Right. So it's probably going to have the highest monthly payment of all of the plans. Right. So I generally don't want that one. But if I'm in that one, at least I know I'm earning forgiveness credit. I discourage people away from the other longer time-driven plans, even though they may have a more favorable payment compared to the 10-year, because they don't provide you any forgiveness credit, right? And again, if I find out that I need that or I could benefit from that forgiveness credit down the road and I don't have it, I can't go back in time and get it, right? So choose a plan that provides you forgiveness credit just in case you need it, right? And generally speaking, that's going to result in the lowest minimum monthly payment that you can get. What you choose to pay after that is up to you, right? But if you at least get that minimum monthly payment that's forgiveness eligible, you're earning that forgiveness credit in case you can use it down the road. Okay, the big beautiful bill. All right, so Dr. Mears and I actually put out a commentary just a couple of weeks ago through the VIN news service. And some of you wanted to know, well, what changes are coming and what's in there. And this is where I'm going to refer you to, right? So this is on VIN News. Anybody can access this. It's a publicly available commentary. But this table here has a pretty good breakdown of what the proposed changes are. Right now, they're still kind of in the sausage making phase here. Right. So the way the budget reconciliation process works is that it has to initiate in the House. The House says, hey, this is what we want to see. The Senate says, okay, great, thanks. This is what we'd like to see. Right. And then they have to reconcile the two. Right. At some point, they're going to have to decide which one of these versions wins, and which version wins and gets the required votes to pass it into law will then determine what's changed when it comes to student loans. Right? There's a lot of other stuff in that reconciliation bill outside of student loans, but these are the important aspects that are currently being bantered about in the student loan section of the budget reconciliation legislation. Right? So what they're talking about doing is eliminating what are called the Department of Ed created plans, right? So ICR, pay as you earn, save. So I talked a little bit about this earlier. We're talking about eliminating pay as you earn, right? If they eliminate pay as you earn and you're in that IDR profile 2, right, that leaves you with less beneficial repayment options to you. If you're in IDR profile 1 and you're eligible for the new version of IBR, right, that means you still have access to a 20-year forgiveness option, right, if the Senate version prevails, which a lot of people think it will, but we don't know until it's actually done, right? So those are things that we're keeping an eye out for. Also in this legislation, in both versions, they're talking about creating a new repayment option called the Repayment Assistance Program, or RAP for short. It would also be forgiveness eligible, but at 30 years, but it would also be public service loan forgiveness eligible. So payments made under RAP would be eligible for public service loan forgiveness, right? So this is, again, kind of what confirms that nobody's eliminating public service loan forgiveness, right? They're going to change the options that might allow you to achieve public service loan forgiveness, right? But there's still going to be pathways to get to public service loan forgiveness. So we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out, right? I don't want to spend too much time on this. I mean, you're welcome to read and see what is potentially out there, right? But until it actually passes and we know what the details are, we can't really make a lot of decisions based on that just yet, right? So this resource is there for you guys to play around with as well, if you would like to know more about that, quote, big, beautiful bill. All right. Yeah, I see a question from Michelle. Yeah, so talking about even if you're in your 40s when you start your specialty path and saving for retirement, again, the later you are to the retirement savings game, the more important it is for you to prioritize that ahead of things like paying down your student loans, right? So I'm going to encourage everyone here, and this comes back to the fact that your federal student loans are the most flexible debt you're ever going to have, right? That should not be on the list of things that you need to take care of first. You have to manage them appropriately, right? Choose the most beneficial repayment plan, Make sure it's based on your income, so it's as low as it possibly can be. And if you have any extra money in your budget during your advanced training, put some of it in some of those tax advantage retirement accounts, like a 401k or a Roth IRA, right? Those will then give you some time. I mean, even if you're in your 40s and your retirement is in your 60s, you still got 2 decades for that to grow, compound growth, tax-free growth. If it's in a Roth, that's going to be tax-free when you take it out. All of those things that I just mentioned are going to generate a higher return for you in the long run than accelerating your student loan payoff. Right? But we tend to go look at our student loans and we see that big honking number, and everything in our fiber of our being says, I need to get rid of it. But all the while, we're sacrificing those other more critical areas. And then 20 years later, we still don't have any retirement funds. And then we feel like we can't retire. Right? Those are things that add more stress than just having federal student loans. Right? So no matter where you are age-wise or in the process, there are opportunities for you to try to get back on track there sooner rather than later. Right? And if you know, once you're done with your advanced training and your income jumps significantly, then you want to play some aggressive catch-up. Right? See if you can hit the maximum annual contributions for something like a 401k. Look for other creative ways to cram more money into some of those tax advantage accounts before you embark on those more aggressive repayment strategies, right? And you can use the income-driven plans to keep your monthly payments low enough to have more money to put into some of those other more critical areas of your financial wellness, right? So those are areas that I'd be focusing on first, sooner rather than later. Let me see if I can get back to this. I think I screwed up my slides here a little bit, but this is how they calculate your monthly payment. And I even put something in here about the repayment assistance program, assuming that that's going to go through in some fashion. But they take a measure, at least the IBR plans, pay as you earn, save before it kind of got canned, use a measure called discretionary income, right? So they take your taxable income, they subtract off an allowance that uses the federal poverty guidelines, and they take a percentage of that number, right? The repayment assistance program is just going to take your taxable income, and depending on where it falls in a certain range, it's going to take between 1 and 10% of that taxable income and use that as the minimum monthly payment. Right, so these are the different time frames. If you have access to the new version of IBR, you'll have a 20-year time frame to forgiveness. The old version of IBR, which is the boat that I'm in, 25-year max until I hit forgiveness. Repayment assistance program has a 30-year maximum time frame to forgiveness. Right, you know, when and if this passes, this is what's going to set up a really interesting dynamic. You know, is it better for me to pay 15% of my discretionary income and hit forgiveness at 25 years, or pay 10% of my taxable income and hit forgiveness at 30 years? Right? That's going to be an interesting math equation to run. Right? So we haven't run it yet because we don't know for sure if that's going to be the case, but once it does, we'll add that into the loan repayment simulator so you all can run those analyses for yourself as well. We take the average intern salary, $56,000, and we run it through all of these different permutations, right? We can see that the new version of IBR wrap pretty close to, you know, the same thing. The old version of IBR, not as close, right? So generally speaking, wrap is similar to the payment that you'll pay under the new version of IBR and pay as you earn. It's a little bit better than the IBR version. It's not nearly as nice as save. Right, so we'll see exactly how that shakes out, but this is, you know, just gives you some idea what that payment looks like. All right, I want to talk about public service loan forgiveness because I saw that come up. All right, so there are 2 different types of forgiveness. There's a forgiveness you can earn under an income-driven plan, right? You make payments based on your income. You hit one of those maximum repayment periods, right? Whether that was 20 years, 25 years, or maybe 30 years. If you still have a balance, that remaining balance is canceled, i.e. forgiven. Generally speaking, forgiven debt, any forgiven debt, is treated as taxable income. Right? So you may have to pay tax on that amount that's forgiven when it's forgiven. Right now, sometimes Congress will pass special tax exemptions for things like forgiven debt. Right now, we have one of those special tax exemptions. Right. So back in 2020 or 2021, Congress passed a tax exemption on any student loan balance that was canceled in the tax years 2021 through 2025 at the federal level. You can still be taxed at the state level, depending on how your state chooses to tax canceled debt, or if you live in a state that has a state tax on income. But it's not automatic, it's taxed at the federal level, but it's likely that it will be, at least until some future down the road where a different Congress might be interested in extending this particular tax exemption. Right. So we have to look at that. You know, people are still hitting forgiveness. Right. And people that hit forgiveness this tax year won't have to pay any federal tax on the loans that are canceled in this particular year. Whether they can, get that loan canceled in this particular year so they can benefit from that federal tax exemption, it's a challenge. It can still happen, but it's definitely a challenge. Then they won't have to pay that particular tax. Public service loan forgiveness is different, right? Public service loan forgiveness is tax-free no matter what. Right. So as long as you do all of the right things, right. So make payments to your direct loans using a qualifying repayment plan, a standard 10-year plan, or the income-driven plans are qualifying, and you meet the full-time employment requirement and make 120 qualifying payments, then you're eligible to receive public service loan forgiveness. Now, somebody asked, I think I saw a question in there about what types of jobs are covered by the public service loan forgiveness program. So they're not, any 501c3 is eligible, right? Every U.S. veterinary institution is a 501c3 nonprofit. So any employment with one of those institutions would be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. Other areas in veterinary medicine that commonly are public service loan forgiveness eligible, shelters that are nonprofit 501c3s. Some zoos and aquariums are organized as 501c3s, although not all of them are. State veterinarians are eligible for public service loan forgiveness. USDA veterinarians are eligible for public service loan forgiveness. All right, so there are a lot of employment opportunities that align with the public service loan forgiveness rules. It's just a matter of whether or not those align with your career goals as well, right? So I would encourage you to look at those. I mean, these are, the likely candidates for public service loan forgiveness. Sometimes the residencies can be a little stubborn, right? Because they don't often consider you to be an employee. However, if you read the public service loan forgiveness form, it's pretty clear to me that a residency should meet the public service loan forgiveness requirements. You have to find somebody there that is willing to sign off on that form for you, right? So if the first person says no, look for somebody else, right? I think that all of those academic residencies should be eligible for public service loan forgiveness, but I don't get to sign those forms, right? So you have to find somebody there that's willing to sign off on those forms. In the human field, they've been doing it for years, right? And that's actually one of the changes that's in the student loan portion of this budget reconciliation bill, is they're no longer going to allow medical and dental residencies to count towards public service loan forgiveness progress, right? Those folks have been doing it for years, right? And we barely have been, depending on the institution that you're doing your residency at. So, and it's not clear whether or not veterinary residencies will actually fall under that designation. I guess we'll find out. Chances are, those veterinary residencies will be exempted as well. But until they are, I would still continue to try to receive public service loan forgiveness credit for those academic residency positions. Again, you never know where your career may take you, right? So you could end up staying on at your academic institution, or getting offered a really unique opportunity in a nonprofit that you've never considered, and those are public service loan forgiveness eligible. So earn as much of that time and bank as much of that forgiveness credit as you possibly can. People are still receiving public service loan forgiveness. This is what it looks like when your balance gets zeroed out, right? So, I mean, just as recent as a couple of weeks ago, we had a colleague on the message boards post about receiving public service loan forgiveness. So even in the midst of all of the uncertainty, people are still receiving public service loan forgiveness. It's more difficult, that's for sure, and it's more work to try to get it, but people are still getting public service loan forgiveness credit. All right, what about deferment? Please don't, right? Especially those of you that are just getting started. The kind of reflex reaction is to put your loans in deferment, right? Because it's the easiest way to get a $0 payment, right? But once your loans come out of deferment, it triggers additional capitalization. So that unpaid interest we talked about can get added to your principal. The higher your principal, the more interest you accrue, the more you're going to pay long term, right? So use an income-driven plan instead. You can have a $0 payment if your income's low enough. Some of these incomes associated with internships and residencies are low enough or close enough to generate a $0 payment using the right repayment plan. The repayment assistance program, so RAP, it won't allow a $0 per month payment. The lowest the payment can be is $10 per month. Great, that's fine. The nice thing about the repayment assistance program is that it will have an unpaid interest subsidy. And what does that mean? It means if your income is low enough to generate a payment that's less than the interest that accrues on your loans, the government will cover the rest. Right? And that's how SAVE worked, right? And Repay before it covered half of your unpaid interest. We're in a period right now, particularly for those of you that are just getting started in your training, where the interest subsidies don't exist. Right? If you weren't lucky enough to already get your loans into SAVE or into that SAVE forbearance before the court blocked it, then the only other options you have right now are options that will accrue interest. Right? And when you think about training, right, internship, maybe a second internship, 3-year residency, 4 or 5 years of additional training, that's a lot of interest. Right? So at some level, I'm rooting for this repayment assistance program to become available, particularly for those of you that are just starting your training, right? Because that unpaid interest subsidy is hugely beneficial, right? To stop that interest from accruing while your income is low. And there's also a provision in that, in those changes, whether or not it survives, I don't know, that will allow you to defer your loans interest-free during periods of, quote, medical and dental residencies, right? I mean, that's a whole can of worms that we're going to have to wait and see exactly how that's going to play out. But there potentially are some better options on the horizon for those of you that are doing internships, residencies with low incomes that would have your interest otherwise accrue, right? So the sooner we can get to some of those options, the sooner you can see your interest stop growing, right? And this is a terrible timing for all of this to happen, right? Because a lot of you are graduating with loans that have relatively higher interest rates than we've had in the past, right? So for those loans to accrue interest, they're going to accrue interest kind of fast and furiously, right? So keep an eye open for those sorts of things. Once that becomes available, that could be something that you're going to want to get your loans into sooner rather than later, so you can decrease or stop that interest from growing during your advanced training pathway. But deferment, deferment doesn't, other than this, potential new provision that allows your interest to stop accruing during quote medical and dental residencies, but you're not going to get forgiveness credit, right? So that's going to be another one of those interesting comparisons. Would you rather have the deferment with no interest accruing, or would you rather use the RAT, receive the unpaid interest subsidy, and earn forgiveness credit? Right. So those are things that we're going to have to work through going forward. But either way, you want to keep your eye open for a potential option to stop your interest from accruing while you're doing that advanced training. Special note on the academic residencies, or anybody that's re-enrolled in school, kind of coming back to that at least half time thing that I talked about at the beginning. Beware of that automatic deferment. Right, deferment is not forgiveness eligible. Right, so if you had your loans in an income-driven plan and were earning public service loan forgiveness, and the system detects that you're back in school at least half time, and they put your loans into deferment, you'll stop receiving forgiveness credit. Good news is you can waive that deferment, right, and put your loans back into the income-driven plan, right? But better to actually waive it ahead of time. Right. So if you're moving, let's say you're moving from an academic internship and you've got your loans in an income-driven plan, and you're earning forgiveness credit, and you're starting an academic residency that'll put you in school at least half time, reach out to your loan servicer and ask them what you need to do to officially waive any automatic deferment that they'll try to put your loans into. Oftentimes, they'll require you to write a letter or send something in that says, I choose to keep my loans in repayment. I want to decline any automatic deferment, or something to that effect, right? But better to do that ahead of time than to catch it after the fact, because it can take some, period of time to get that undone. So something to be aware of there. Okay. Treatment plans. I'm going to leave this stuff up, and then I'm going to start diving into some of the questions, right? But I want you guys to think about too, what is your student loan magic wand outcome, right? If you could wave a magic wand, what would you like to see happen? And, we got to be a little, I know I'm giving you a magic wand here, but we can't just say, I want my student loans to go away, right? Of course, we all do, right? But what do you think is the ideal outcome for your student loans, and how can we help get you to that ideal outcome, right? Because lately, I have been hearing a lot of anxiety and a lot of students saying, forget the internship residency stuff. I can't afford it, right? And you can, right? It's just more complicated than it used to be, right? So, again, kind of think about what is that magic wand outcome for your student loans, and how can we help you get there? All right, so I'm going to look at Amanda's question here. With SAVE likely going away, is there an anticipation that under that plan will automatically be put into a different IDR? Yeah, so the current legislation, with the current proposals, anybody that's using one of those plans that they eliminate would automatically be put into IBR first, or if that repayment assistance program becomes available, you would have the option of applying to it, right? So you would automatically be transitioned into the version of IBR that you're eligible for, right? And that comes back to that IDR eligibility, right? Which plans are you eligible for, right? For this particular person who's in SAVE, if they automatically moved him into a next version of an income-driven plan, it's going to be IBR 2009. Right? Now, you may have the option to apply for a different plan, right? But we're going to have to wait and see what those details look like. I have another case here that we can upload for somebody who's in IDR profile 1. This is a 2024 grad. This one, so $2,000 of student loans, interest rate relatively low, which is great, right? Their loans are consolidated. I see a single loan remaining here. I see that their loan is in a standard 30-year plan. This is a tricky one, right? So this is a person who applied for the SAVE forbearance before the court blocked it. And they weren't granted access to SAVE, right? Because it doesn't show SAVE as the repayment plan. However, they are in what's called an administrative forbearance with a 0% interest rate. So it's essentially the same thing as being in SAVE, but their loans aren't labeled as being in SAVE. And this is somebody who posted, and we're working through their case on the student debt message board area as well. But you have to actually kind of dig into the file itself to uncover that particular aspect. So if you're one of those people, and this is unique to those who applied for SAVE in 2024, around the time it was blocked. So the court blocked it in July of 2024. If you applied for SAVE, anytime before then, or even immediately after, when the application was still available, but they weren't granting anyone access, you were able to get your loans into this special administrative forbearance. And one way to check is to look in your file to see what your interest rate shows. And behind the scenes, the actual interest rate shows 0%. So that's how we know that they're in that administrative forbearance and they're not accruing any additional interest, which again is a great place for this person's loans to be while they're finishing up their residency training. And they have some time to go yet, right? So they're not going to finish their training for a couple of years. So they would want this particular status to persist as long as possible, right? Or maybe until there's another plan that they can jump into that will cover their interest. But you could see how beneficial that is, right? I mean, this person graduated a year ago, right? And they only have $5,000 of unpaid interest on their loans, right? Even though they have $197,000 of principal, and theoretically, they should be accruing about $1,000 a month of interest, right? So that unpaid interest subsidy is hugely beneficial if you're receiving it, not something that's very hard, that you can get right now if you're not already in SAVE or in this special administrative forbearance that this particular person is in. All right. So next question here. Hi, I am this first example, and I believe Repay before it became SAVE has a 20-year forgiveness path. So I would have another 15 years to forgiveness unless I am misremembering the forgiveness period. So would it make sense to wait for forgiveness? So yeah, that comes back to making sure we check and see what is my forgiveness count, right? And then I use the simulator to project whether or not I'm likely to reach forgiveness, right? So, and we did that for that particular person, and it was close, right? So, you paid the simulator showed that you pay the balance to zero a few years before you would hit forgiveness, right? That suggests to me that I want a little bit more data, right? I'm not going to embark on an aggressive student loan repayment strategy until I see a little more information on what my income potential is, right? And as you're finishing your residency, I mean, you have kind of an idea, but until you actually practice as a specialist for a few years, you're not going to really know, do I like this job? And, what is my earning potential? And when you have a better idea of what that is and what your budget looks like, then I might adjust my repayment strategy a couple of years into that, right? But I probably wouldn't embark on that aggressive repayment strategy right out of the gate based on what I saw in the loan repayment simulator there. Another question about SAVE: would it be prudent to wait for the SAVE legal forbearance to run its course before switching into another income-based plan if starting a residency program in a few weeks? Absolutely, right? If you're in the SAVE program now, if your loans show SAVE, right, or you're in one of those administrative forbearances that have a 0% interest rate and you're starting a residency, then you're in the best position you can possibly be in, right? You're not being charged interest and you don't have a payment due. So you want that situation to persist as long as it can. Now, I don't know exactly how long that's going to be, right? If everything kind of happens as expected with the legislation and something passes and there's some changes, it's likely going to be next summer where everybody's going to get pushed out of their respective plans and into whatever the new ones are. Right? So you probably have another year here to see that play out. Right? And if you're in save with a 0% interest rate for that year, that's great. Right? Stay there. So this question, I think we've already answered covering the repayment assistance program stuff. So will RAP have any interest subsidy? Yes, it's supposed to, right? So if your payment is less than the interest that accrues, then the government will cover the rest under the repayment assistance program. Will it be better than IBR 2014? Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know, and I doubt it, right? So if we think of what I know of the income-driven plans after looking at these for the last 12 years or so, the longer you're in, or the longer the forgiveness horizon, the more you're going to pay, right? And the payment, it's going to be interesting to see, right? It's going to be tempting to take the repayment assistance program subsidy versus using something like IBR 2014 that doesn't provide a subsidy. That's really going to depend on the specifics, right? And that's going to, some of that comes down to a crystal ball, right? I mean, for those of you that are heading into surgery or neurology or neurosurgery or one of the higher paying specialties, right? Using RAP to cover your interest during the training to keep the balance lower because you're likely to pay it off before hitting forgiveness is probably going to be the best strategy. But for those of you that finish your specialty training and are still likely to hit forgiveness, particularly under a 20-year pathway like IBR 2014, then you're probably going to want to use IBR 2014 and let the interest accrue during the training. Right. So, but those are things we don't have the tools yet in place to really crunch those numbers. So until that becomes a reality, we're going to have to look at that a little more closely. I answered that one. Okay, here's a question about pay as you earn. I am in and have been in pay as you earn, and it seems to be in this forbearance, but I am unsure. I am on a $0 payment with 0% interest. Is this a thing too? No, it's not. Right. So this anonymous person who posted this question about being in pay and having $0 payments and 0% interest, go get your student aid data file from studentaid.gov and upload it into the My Student Loans tool. Right. I suspect you're going to see that you're actually in save or that you applied for save and your loans were placed into that administrative forbearance. Right. It may still show pay as you earn because your loans were in pay as you earn previously, but chances are it's technically in this administrative forbearance that lives somewhere between save and where you were previously. So kind of like this particular person's loans show the standard 30-year plan, but they're technically in that 0% interest administrative forbearance. If your loans show pay and you have a 0% interest rate behind the scenes, your loans aren't technically in pay as you earn anymore, right? And you're no longer earning forgiveness credit, right? So, those are things that we'll want to, look at a little bit more critically by uploading your file to the My Student Loans page. And then ideally, if you have your case set to be reviewed on the student debt message board area, those are things that we'll look at, right? So it kind of gives me an excuse to kind of come over here and show you what this looks like. So if you check the box in your student debt income signalment form that you want to have your case posted anonymously on the boards, this is what it looks like, right? So the signalment form submission gets moved over anonymously, right? Here's our 2016 grad who's finishing up their residency with their anticipated income. Right, so we take all of this data that we've been talking about, right? We analyze what we see using the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center tools, walk you through that, kind of give you a written record that you can go back to and review and critically evaluate, and then come back and ask us some more questions. Right, so this is some of these questions that you're asking specifically, like the one about, pay as you earn and a 0% interest rate, it's hard for me to answer without actually seeing your student aid data file and ideally doing it through the message board area here. Right. So, but those are the things I'd be looking for. For someone pursuing public service loan forgiveness who is currently on administrative forbearance, what are the chances we will be able to buy back these months when we reach the end of our qualifying payments? I'm in a residency, so it seems like a wise decision to stay on safe for now. Yeah, that's a tough one. The public service loan forgiveness buyback is technically only eligible for those people who have already met the threshold of 120 qualifying payments if they include the period of time they're trying to pay back or buy back. So if you're in a residency program now, right, you aren't close enough to have the 120 monthly payments needed. I wouldn't worry about the buyback. I mean, the buyback to me is more for those folks who are sitting at 115 qualifying payments right now and just need a handful more to get across the finish line. And they probably otherwise would have been there if not for the federal court blocking save, right? That's really what that buyback is for. If you're just kind of getting started here in the training process, and you think you're going to earn public service loan forgiveness because your career path aligns with maybe working in academia even after your training, then get there without having to worry about the buyback. The buyback is really messy, right? And it's really hard for those folks who are, kind of the target person for it to actually get it across the finish line. Right? When you get to that point where maybe that's the only thing left, great. Let's talk about the buyback again. But in the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. Whether or not I would give up the save forbearance early on to earn public service loan forgiveness credit, man, I probably wouldn't. I would probably rather have the no payment, no interest accruing and forego the forgiveness credit for now than switch out of the save forbearance to force myself into a monthly payment and see my interest accrue just so I can earn public service loan forgiveness credit. But, if I have more information on that, I'd be able to better answer that question. So if we could see what you anticipate doing and where you are in the process, that might help to color in that evaluation a little bit more. But right now, I'd be inclined to maybe not leave that save forbearance benefit in favor of, seeing my interest balance grow and have a monthly payment just so I can earn that public service loan forgiveness credit. But that is definitely a tough call. Yeah, and kind of related to that, another question came in. I'm in the save forbearance. Should I be concerned about not gaining forgiveness credits while I'm in forbearance? Of course, I'd rather earn forgiveness credit, but when I'm matching it up against not having a payment due, not seeing my interest accrue, and knowing that most veterinarians are walking around with six-figure student debt, the potential for your interest to grow is pretty high, right? So I'm pretty comfortable with my loans. I mean, the save forbearance is kind of like your loans are in suspended animation. Right? You're not earning forgiveness credit, but they're not costing you anything, right? That's really helpful. So if I have a relatively high balance and, I can reduce the amount that's going to grow, so it reduces the amount that I'm going to pay after I finish my training, I'm loving this zero interest forbearance, right? So it's really, really rare. Of all the times that I think of that we've recommended people move out of the save forbearance, it's those folks that are really, really close to reaching forgiveness, right? Whether that's public service loan forgiveness, or maybe it's one of those folks that are trying to earn income-driven repayment forgiveness this year, particularly while there's the tax exemption, right? That's probably not relevant to any of you, right? Any of the people here are likely in an internship, in a residency, kind of early on in the repayment process, relatively speaking, and probably have very low forgiveness counts, right? If you have a high forgiveness count and switching out of the save forbearance would help you get across that finish line relatively soon, and particularly this year, then maybe that makes sense. But again, that's probably not anybody here, right? So if I'm in that save forbearance, I'm going to enjoy that for as long as I can, and I'm rooting for that to last as long as it possibly can, right? So just to keep those that loan balance from growing. Okay, different question here, a little different situation for switching out of save. I'm in save and work for a qualified nonprofit to be able to earn public service loan forgiveness. Should I switch or wait until RAP or switch to another income-driven repayment taking public service loan forgiveness? Yeah, again, I'm going to need more information there, right? So if you submitted your student debt and income signalment form and check the box to have it posted on the boards, then we'll do that, right? We're still working our way through all of the submissions here. And we've got quite a backlog this time of year with the new grad season, and then also this internship residency playbook. We've got quite a few to work through. I'm going to need a little bit more information on that one, right? If you want to provide it here, that's fine. I'm happy to help try to work through that, but it really kind of requires more information on, do you see yourself sticking with this job long term? If so, is there a rush to switch out of the save plan now, right? I mean, if I'm kind of what I affectionately refer to as one of those public service loan forgiveness lifers, right? It's hard to envision yourself working for any kind of other organization other than a nonprofit. Then there's really no rush to move out of the save forbearance, right? Wait until you see what's next and enjoy the $0 payment, the no interest accrual, and you'll pick back up on that public service loan forgiveness credit after, right? After that save forbearance is officially ended. But if you're really close, you're knocking on the door of public service loan forgiveness, you need less than maybe 12 months of payments, and you're just itching to get it so you can move away from that job into maybe a different something else that you envision doing after you get public service loan forgiveness. Well, that's a different story, right? So it kind of requires us to know a little bit more like that. All right, so another question just came in. I'm planning for internship next year. In the meantime, I will work. Right now, I'm in grace period and post-enrollment deferment for my Grad Plus loans. Do these Grad Plus loans capitalize their interest after 6 months are done? No, so the first time, this is the reason why you may want to not consolidate, right? One of the rule changes that took effect in 2022 was how capitalization is treated for loans that are first entering repayment, right? So your veterinary school loans that just entered their grace period, or in the case of your direct grad plus loans, that post-graduation 6-month deferment, they should not capitalize their interest as long as that 6-month grace period / deferment naturally plays out, right? So that was one of those changes that took place that wasn't affected by any of the recent court rulings. So those capitalization changes are still in place, where loans that are first entering repayment after their grace period ends, the unpaid interest is not capitalized. It's kept separate in an unpaid interest bucket, as I kind of illustrated with these cases, right? So it just will stay in this unpaid interest bucket separate and not get added to the principal. Any loans that you have that were previously in repayment and re-entered deferment when you entered veterinary school, those loans will capitalize the interest that accrued during veterinary school when they re-enter repayment. And if you consolidate your loans, they always capitalize the unpaid interest. right? So that's what has kind of set up what I've been calling the consolidation conundrum. And that was the blog post that I wrote for new grads specifically for 2025. Let me see if I can find that quickly. Oh, I think this is it. Have this open in a different. So these are, I included that actually. Somebody asked about this on the boards recently. So these are the changes that took effect in 2022 that eliminated a lot of the capitalization events. And this is what is detailed here, right? So the first time your loans enter repayment, they're not going to be capitalized. That was a change prior to 2022. Your loans would capitalize when they first entered repayment. When you leave IBR, the loan, any unpaid interest you have will be capitalized, right? That's a consideration when we talk about, which plans am I going to use or which plans do I choose if I'm in that 2025 new grad landscape, right? Do I want to choose IBR? What if I want to leave IBR afterwards? I might see a lot of my unpaid interest capitalized, right? So that's where, some of those rules become really important. But in regards to the question specifically about, will my unpaid interest capitalize for those loans from veterinary school? It shouldn't, as long as you don't consolidate them and you let their grace periods run that course. But in order to get, this is what that creates kind of a complexity around that. I mean, you're planning to enter an internship. Your grace period ends 6 months after you graduated. You're going to have to remember to apply for a different plan, because after that grace period ends naturally, they put your loans into a standard 10-year plan automatically, right? So unless you remember to apply around 60 days before that grace period ends for a different repayment option, then you're going to have a really high monthly payment in that standard 10-year plan if you don't remember to do that, right? So that's the danger of waiting for that grace period to expire, because you can't really apply for a repayment plan now, right? You have to wait until that grace period is closer to ending before they'll actually entertain that application for your income-driven plan. So just weird quirks of the system. It seems like sometimes they make it harder than it needs to be, and err on the side of penalizing you by making you have to wait, right? And it's easy to forget, especially as you start those internships and now you're on your third straight week of overnights and you have to remember to apply for your student loan repayment strategy, right? So just set some alarms in your calendar and make sure you're ready to go, around 60 days before that grace period ends. All right, so let's see. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I know we're running close to the 2-hour window here. So does anybody have any additional questions, things that we didn't cover that maybe you thought we would cover during the session? We'll make all of these slides and everything available too, so you can click through anything that we didn't get to. I always have way more content in here than I plan to click through, but I want to get that initial kind of information out to you all and then see what kind of questions you have. Are there any other questions before we close it down? So I see a couple here. If being switched to repayment assistance program, will it restart to 30 years of repayment? No. So the repayment assistance program, the proposed legislative language will honor the time served, if you will, the time you've already earned towards forgiveness in the other income-driven repayment plan. So it won't restart that clock. Miko's asking, so if you already answered this, public service loan forgiveness requires 30 hours of work per week. Would working additional hours in a non-public service loan forgiveness job disqualify you from public service loan forgiveness? Now, you can work as many jobs as you want, right? You're really only limited by the number of hours you have in the day. As long as you're meeting the public service loan forgiveness requirements for one or multiple of those jobs, right? You can even have multiple part-time public service loan forgiveness jobs that get you across the required 30 hours per week on average. Once you meet that threshold, you're making a qualified public service loan forgiveness payment. If you are doing any number of other things on the side that are not related to public service loan forgiveness, you can still do that, right? Now, your income determines your monthly payment, right? So the more you're working, presumably the more income you're earning, the higher your payments are going to be, right? Which kind of negates some of the public service loan forgiveness benefit. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, right? It's just something to be aware of, right? So you can earn public service loan forgiveness as long as you're meeting all of those requirements, including the average 30 hours per week. If you're working additional hours at a private practice, that's not, there's nothing that I can think of that, quote, negates you from earning public service loan forgiveness credit other than not meeting the requirements. Roman's asking, have you heard if interest will start accruing on those in save before save is over? Well, I don't know. I haven't heard that. But I also haven't heard a plan or timeline for winding down the save forbearance, right? So, and I think they kind of have to happen simultaneously, right? In order for them to start charging you interest again, they have to have a plan for moving people out of the save forbearance. So they either have to come up with a process for saying, okay, the court has ruled and nobody can use save anymore, and we're all pushing you here, right? But they haven't done that. And I think instead of doing that, they're pushing this legislation forward instead. So presuming they get that across the finish line, my guess is they're going to let that probably be the official timeline. Now, they could do both. They could pass the legislation that says, hey, this stuff is going to take effect in July 2026. And then a month later, they could say everybody that's in the save forbearance has to pick a different plan, right? But they haven't done that yet, right? So I'm not too worried about it. I guess, I'm keeping an eye open, of course, right, to see, what is my loan servicer telling me? What is the Department of Education saying? What does my anniversary date say for my save? But I'm not getting any indication yet that I'm going to have any interest accrue or I have a payment due for those people that are in the save forbearance. We will get that at some point. I just don't know when it's coming. Anonymous asks, can I post a new signalment form on an old forum post I made? Absolutely. That's exactly why we do this the way we do, right? So we've got a number of those. I don't know if this will get lucky enough here, but this person, for example, we'll pick on this person. This is a 2025 Mizzou grad, and they submitted a form probably as part of the new grad playbook. In May 2025, this was their initial signalment form submission. We go through, we do the analysis here. They come back and ask some more questions, right? They can certainly submit a new signalment form response. And then if we see that you have another post already available, we'll merge that new signalment form that you submitted with your existing thread, so we keep everything together, right? This is kind of my medical record keeping system here, right? All of this student debt stuff that we do on VIN is kind of patterned after how we take care of our clients in a practice, right? I kind of like to see a history. What did we cover so far? What was their circumstances a year ago? What are these new signalment form circumstances that I need to factor in so I can look at the history and work that into the updated recommendations? So absolutely, please submit an updated signalment form. That's what we hope you're going to do, right? And if it requires 20 years of signalment forms to get you through repayment, so be it, right? At least we have a record of what we've covered, what's changed, what we should recommend next, right? So that's the intent of how the student debt folder is set up. Nicoletta asks, can you, hey, hi. It's amazing that you're already through school and now asking about repayment. So congratulations. Can you get rid of deferment? Can you get rid of deferred amount if you had to take off a semester for medical leave? Can you get rid of deferred amount? I'm not sure I understand that one. Maybe your loans are in a medical deferment, in which case, if you requested a deferment, you should be able to get the loans out of them, but they should also be automatically put into a grace period after the system recognizes that you've finished school, right? So if you still have one that's kind of stuck in a weird status, that's something that we could talk about. I would need to see your loans and see if we can identify that one, but we might be able to reach out to the Department of Education or even open a case through your congressional representative to see if we can get a loan that might be in a weird special deferment status out of that status. All right, sorry if I missed it, but will everyone be eligible for RAP in the proposal or only certain borrowers from certain timeframes? No, everybody will be eligible for RAP. In fact, new borrowers, people who start borrowing after 2026 would only be able to use RAP, right? The people that are kind of already have loans or are already eligible for some of the older repayment options would be able to choose to use RAP. And then we have to see which version wins, because in the House version, they're saying if you choose RAP, you're stuck with RAP. You can't select your way out of it. But in the Senate version, they're saying, no, if you select RAP, you can choose IBR if you're eligible for it. So we're gonna have to see which one wins out on that one. But current borrowers, so the folks that are likely to be here, are will be able to choose RAP, or the plans that they're currently eligible for, at least the ones that survive the legislation. But new borrowers, future borrowers, would only be able to choose RAP. Emily asks, as someone planning a wedding soon, should I be concerned about the option for being married and filing separately being taken away? Would we be grandfathered into any new legislation? So it's a good question. As far as I'm aware, the new legislation for the new plans, including RAP, would allow you to separate your income from your spouse as long as you file separately. IBR still specifies that, right? So there should be no problem there. RAP, it's not written very clearly, right? They're going to have to, there's enough structure there for us to get a basic understanding of how it's supposed to work. But after the legislation passes, then they kind of fill in some of the, nuts and bolts of how it's going to be executed, usually through the regulatory process. So we may have to wait and see exactly whether or not RAP will allow you to separate your income from your spouse. I suspect it will, but I don't know that for sure, right? But if not, IBR does. So you'll be able to do that at least through IBR. Okay, so another question about the post-enrollment. So contributing. Okay, so this is building on that previous question. So I graduated May of this year, and my grad loans apparently were scheduled for repayment on July of this year, even though I was always enrolled full-time and never took breaks. So I was unsure how it was automatically in post-enrollment deferment. Do you think I should inquire about it? Any balance that was capitalized? So yeah, this is one that I would want to look at on the message boards more closely. We want to make sure we know as much about your loans as possible, so we ask the right questions. So it can get confusing. Let me see. I think I've got I'll show you. I've got a new grad sample here too, and I can illustrate this. This is something that I generally avoid talking about because it's just so stupid confusing, but I think it's worth it in this particular context. Your direct unsubsidized loans, there are two primary types of loans that you have for veterinary school, right? They're direct unsubsidized. Those hit limits, as you're aware, right? And anything you need above that are fulfilled in grad plus loans. Direct unsubsidized loans are the loans that have an official grace period. And after you graduate, those direct unsubsidized loans will enter a status that's actually called the grace period. Right now, this is a great illustration because this person actually has loans from before vet school too, right? And they had already entered repayment. So they don't get a second grace period, right? So after this person, this is a 2025 grad, this file is relatively recent, right? They uploaded this file, 4 days ago, right? So their direct unsubsidized loans from veterinary school are in the grace period. We see that status in this reflected in this file. They also have loans from before vet school that already used up their grace period that are now in repayment, right? These are loans that technically this unpaid interest should capitalize, right? Based on those capitalization changes, but they also don't get a second grace period, right? So they re-enter repayment 30 days after you graduate. So we want to differentiate, are these loans that are from vet school, are these loans that are from before vet school that maybe already used up their grace period, and maybe that's why you're seeing them re-enter repayment. One of the other things that could be happening is the grad plus loans don't technically enter a grace period. They are in a post-graduation deferment period, right? That have a 6-month window that is equal to the same time frame as the grace period, right? So it's easy to get confused between the status that you see on the plus loans versus the status you see on the unsubsidized loans, particularly for new graduates, right? That's something that, maybe someday in the future we can try to fix through a feature, but these loans aren't technically in a standard 10-year plan. They will be after that 6-month post-deferment period ends, unless you apply for an income-driven plan before that, right? But you may be seeing that it's in a standard 10-year plan, but it's technically in deferment. And this is another thing where you actually have to open up the file and look, right? And I can help you do that, right? If you post on the message boards, we can look in there and differentiate between those loans. But those are the things that we're going to be looking for before you go opening a case with the student loan ombudsman to make sure that we understand what status your loans are currently in, right? Versus, starting to ask a bunch of questions that you're probably going to get some really confusing answers back from if you start calling your loan servicer about. So sorry, that's generally why I kind of avoid that too, but it comes up particularly in the new grad scenarios, right? And those grad plus loans, unfortunately, coming back to the idea that these federal student loans are just unnecessarily complicated, right? Why they just don't give these the same status as the other ones, I will never understand, right? But that's just the way the system is set up, right? So we kind of work with what we've got here. So, but these loans, because they're from vet school, technically won't enter repayment until this grace period is over, right? So even though it says a standard 10-year plan, right? So it's easy to get misled by that, but let's make sure that we have something to ask about, before we go barking up a tree that maybe we don't have to. All right, so another question here. If there is an income cutoff where IBR does not work out, so repayment simulation was showing overall I would pay more with the tax bomb once my income went over 200,000. So not sure if there's another way around this. So yeah, there are some guidelines we can give you, right? And that's where the debt to income ratio come in. Maybe I didn't get to that particular slide, but depending on where you are in repayment and what your debt to income ratio is, we can guesstimate those quote break even points, which is essentially what you're asking about. However, if you're projected to reach forgiveness I'm inclined to kind of let that play out a little bit, right? So, even though the forgiveness pathway might technically cost you more than paying the balance to zero more quickly, that's where I want to more critically evaluate your budget, other critical financial wellness areas, and see how much flexibility do you have to accelerate your payoff without sacrificing those other more critical areas of your financial wellness, right? And those are things that we do on the message boards as well, right? So when we start to look at, okay, well, it does look like we're going to pay a little bit more if we hit forgiveness, but what kind of extra cash flow do I have, right? And what can I do with that extra cash flow? Can I outgrow that difference between paying the loans to zero faster versus letting the forgiveness pathway play out, right? If I could take that additional cash flow, put it into some other area of my financial wellness that experiences compound growth, tax-free growth, helps me buy a practice, helps me buy a home, something like that, then I don't want to accelerate the student loan payoff just because, right? So that gets, that's a little bit more advanced repayment strategy type stuff. And those are things that, we can take a look at more closely on the message boards based on your answers to the signalment form submissions. But great question. Those are kind of why, again, why we have the message board threads as well, right? Because it's not always clear what we should do based on what we see in the loan repayment simulator, right? So if we have questions, right, we can grab our simulation link, right? There's a save share link here, copy it to our clipboard and post it in our message board thread and ask, hey, I'm seeing in my, my simulation here that it would actually, this is a good illustration of this, right? Numerically, it's a little cheaper to pay the balance off in 10 years versus, the forgiveness pathway, right? But the monthly payment amounts are significantly different, right? So what can I do with that extra cash flow, maybe in the short term here, until I feel really good about my overall financial strategy, and then reevaluate whether or not it makes sense to try to aggressively pay off my student loans. But those are things we can talk about. It helps to see what you're seeing, right? So if you share your simulation link in the message board thread, then we can see what you're seeing, and then we can provide a better answer in that discussion. Cool. Great follow-up questions. So excellent. I know it's kind of whittled down here in terms of those of you that are left. Unless you guys have any additional questions, we'll put a bow on this one, and we'll put the recording out with all of the support materials that we have, and we'll start working our way through those signalment form submissions and continuing those conversations on the message boards, and keep asking those questions. And as you work your way through your training and as your career path unfolds, you'll have more information. We'll have more information to help answer those questions and adjust your repayment strategy from there.
Thanks, Tony. Everybody keep a lookout in your email the next couple days for an email from student.vinfoundation.org. And thanks, Taylor, as well, for being on the back end.
Yeah, and thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Taylor, for sticking it out. And we'll catch you guys over on the boards.
Thank you.
Thanks.